The Freakish Family, Part 2. Aside from the constant threat of Hyrak, who served as Lamb, Carleen, Varney, the monster, and Sikaina's greatest adversary during this time, the Freakish family battled a wide range of other monsters, creatures, and strange enemies, and went on many incredible adventures together. Among their deadliest foes was Miss Havisham, a witch who sought to trap our world in eternal darkness. Havisham's turn to darkness was caused by the possession of her fiancé by a demon. On the night before their wedding, a demon took over the man she was to marry's body and jilted her at the altar, breaking Havisham's heart. The demon then went on to commit many gruesome murders in his body, making him the most wanted man in London. Havisham became a recluse, not just out of heartbreak that the sweet, kind, wonderful man she loved more than anything had become a monster, but also because people started blaming her, including his family, for turning him. Havisham's family had a history of witchcraft, and though neither she nor her mother had ever used magic at any point, sadly the stigma still continued. Many today believe the demon actually did target her fiancé as revenge for something her family had done to it in the past. The demon later abandoned Havisham's fiancé after 20 years, leaving him a withered-out husk in an alleyway. He nevertheless survived through both his love of Havisham and hatred of the demon, and afterwards tracked down Havisham. Being able to convince her of what happened, Havisham then turned to her family's magics to get her revenge on the demon. Though she was able to exorcise it, sadly her fiancé was killed in the process, while saving her from the demon's last attempts at lashing out before its banishment. Driven mad from the grief of the man she loved suffering to such an extent, the decades she'd wasted hiding from the public who blamed her, and hating him when it was not his fault, Havisham vowed to make the entire world pay, and delved deeper into her family's magics to do that. Through her own family's secrets, as well as those of numerous other sorcerers, she was able to reach through her resources. Havisham discovered an ancient spell which could force victims to live out their worst fears forever. She planned to amplify it using all of the magics of her family to spread out across the world, making everyone suffer. In order to make the spell work, however, Havisham would have to get the tears of 12 broken-hearted innocent boys. She groomed her young niece Estella to help her get what she wanted, making her as bitter, twisted, and wicked as she was. Estella then seduced several young men and broke their hearts. The latest young man Estella tricked and hurt, however, Pip, was an associate of a demon named Abel. Years ago, Abel was on the run from the mob in London, and after being wounded in a graveyard, the young Pip, having no idea what a demon even was, helped him escape. This act moved Abel to the point where he went out of his way to help others, gradually overcoming his demonic nature. As a result of this, he came into contact with Carleen, with the two developing something of a friendship. Abel, meanwhile, knew what Havisham was like, having stopped her from stealing a magical artifact a few months prior. As soon as he found out Estella was linked with her, he summoned Carleen and the others. Together, along with Pip, they confronted Havisham at her mansion as she was preparing to cast her spell. As a final act of the spell, Estella had to be consumed by fiery magics too. Havisham summoned the tormented spirits of hell to try and fight off Carleen and the others. In the ensuing fight, Estella was rescued by Pip, whilst Abel was killed, sacrificing himself to save them both from a vengeful Havisham, who was finally consumed by her own fiery magics. The five also came into conflict with the infamous Jack the Ripper. The serial killer, whose identity was not known to the general public for centuries, was in fact one of Peter Pan's legendary lost boys. Peter Pan was the adopted son of the legendary Greek god of the same name. During the god's battle with the dragons, Pan's actions indirectly led to the death of a boy. Whilst they may have come over as callous, the gods, at least at that point in their history, tried to avoid civilian casualties as much as they could. However, Pan hid an important weapon in a small village, thinking it was the perfect hiding place, as the dragons didn't want to harm humanity any more than they did. Sadly, however, Pan didn't count on a renegade dragon being willing to attack the village to get it. One of the boys of the village, wanting to protect his family, stole the weapon and fled, being killed by the dragon in the process. Pan was so overcome by grief that he brought the boy back using magic. Unfortunately, however, Pan's magics were so clumsy, given that he didn't put much practice in as other gods, preferring to indulge his own pleasures, the boy was rendered an immortal. In fact, he even developed certain godlike powers, as Pan had used his own blood in the spell in order to ensure its success. Sadly, none of the other gods could undo what Pan had done afterwards, as if they removed his blood, then it would be in danger of destroying the boy's soul completely. The boy, whose real name has been lost to history, lived with his family for years, until he eventually outlived them, after which Pan took a more direct role in his upbringing. He tended to spoil the boy out of guilt, and even gave him his own island, constructed entirely through magic, called Neverland. Pan also regularly played with the boy, that he came to refer to simply as Pan Jr. However, after the war with Ares broke out, Pan naturally had less time to spend with the child, and instead placed other strange creatures there to keep the boy company. After Ares' defeat, when the gods planned to flee the earth, Pan offered to let the boy come with him, but ironically, Pan Jr., in the years his adopted father spent away, had actually grown to enjoy being the king of his kingdom of Neverland. Pan allowed the boy to stay, but cast a spell to keep Neverland hidden from the rest of the world, with even Pan Jr. only being allowed to travel outside of it every now and again. He also couldn't spend too long outside of the island. Pan Jr., however, agreed to this as he loved Neverland, which, due to its magical nature, could constantly change and keep the boy entertained. In time, however, even Pan Jr. grew bored of the monsters and fairies of the island, and began to abduct children to play with him for a short while before sending them home. These children were referred to as the Lost Boys by Pan Jr. Reportedly, the first of them, who Pan Jr. always regarded as being the brother he never had, was called Peter. In tribute to his friend, Pan Jr. later became known as Peter Pan. Peter Pan's greatest enemy, meanwhile, was the renegade pirate Captain Hook, who had originally arrived on Neverland in the hopes of utilizing the god's magic to destroy an ancient sea beast known as the Kraken that was attacking his hometown. Hook had left decades ago to explore the ocean and slay the supernatural menace that lived beneath its waves. His home village, being a seaside village, made it vulnerable to attack from horrors of the deep, such as the vampiric trageurs. Whilst Hook was a great hero for many years, whose knowledge of magics was so great that he was able to overcome Pan's defences, Peter Pan still refused to let him have any of the magics in Neverland, having been sworn to protect them from his adopted father above all else. Sadly, Hook's home village was destroyed by the vengeful Kraken, which caused the pirate to swear revenge on Peter Pan. For the next few centuries, Hook was a constant thorn in Peter Pan as well as generations of Lost Boys' sides, though as time went on, Hook became more obsessed with stealing the magics than his revenge, believing he could change the world with them for the better. His past exploits had gone to his head, with Hook genuinely believing that he was the best man to wield the god's magics, and that it was his destiny to do so. He kept himself eternally young through other spells he had picked up on his journeys. In spite of the very real danger Hook represented, Peter came to enjoy the challenge of fighting him, and allowed the pirate to continue existing. Whilst Peter had started out as a good-natured child who was willing to sacrifice himself to save his family, sadly, in the centuries he had been indulged, Peter Pan had become corrupted and callous in his treatment of others, particularly his own lost boys. Still, now and again flashes of his old heroic nature did sometimes resurface. The man who became Jack the Ripper, meanwhile, was always a tearaway. Living on the streets after his parents caught him attempting to strangle his sister, The young Jack was selected by Peter due to his seemingly rebellious nature in the mid-17th century, with Peter having no idea of the true extent of his crime. Despite being several thousand years old, Peter was still incredibly naive. Jack soon became one of Peter's favourite lost boys, and stayed with him for longer than any human lifespan. Peter was so amused by his antics that he turned a blind eye to the horrific abuse Jack often inflicted on the other, supposedly weaker, lost boys. However, Jack's truly psychotic nature was eventually exposed to Peter when he started murdering some of Hook's men. Jack did this simply because he had become bored of the pirates, whilst Peter still wanted to play with Hook. Jack was discreet at first. He hoped that if more of Hook's men died, rather than try and replace them so soon, Peter would just give up, as he was very lazy. However, the latest mother of Pan's lost boys soon rumbled Jack's plan. Peter Pan always chose one young girl, usually slightly older than the lost boys, who were younger than Pan, to help look after the lost boys. As a punishment, Peter Pan cast Jack out of Neverland. Normally, whenever someone left Neverland, they would undergo a specific process which allowed their body to adjust to normal air outside of Neverland. With Jack, however, Peter was so angry he simply tossed him out. As a result of this, Jack began to age at an accelerated rate a few years after arriving back in our world, due to having lived far longer than any normal human could in Neverland. In order to regain his former youth, Jack began killing people to harvest their blood for a ritual to make himself younger. He chose as his victims prostitutes, both because he believed that nobody would miss them when they were gone, and his pathological hatred of women. As evidenced by his attack on his sister, he always found girls repulsive and disgusting. But the fact that it had been one of Peter's mothers that got him kicked out of Neverland only strengthened his sick hatred. The Freakish Family unmasked Jack's identity with the help of Peter's former mother, who had him exiled in the first place. The authorities had been unable to, as the criminal used magics to both conceal his appearance and cover his tracks. The former mother of Neverland was named Marina, and had left the island on her own volition, due to what had happened with Jack. Peter, despite being ruthless and callous in many areas, such as his dealings with Hook, at least always respected his lost boys and mother's wishes to go home. She was 23 when Jack began his killing spree, and as soon as she realised that he was responsible, she went to Carlene's agency for help. Even then, however, it was not an easy task. Nevertheless, the five did eventually track the sick killer down to his lair, which was guarded by deformed clones of the crocodile from Neverland. Jack had a run-in with the beast, where he managed to steal one of its teeth, which he kept after being exiled from Neverland. He hoped that he could use it to harvest Neverland magic, but when it became obvious that he couldn't, instead Jack tried to create several clones of the crocodile, all horrific and crude, but all still dangerous and loyal to Jack. Finally, Jack had also stolen Hook's famous hook hand after a confrontation with the pirate, which was the very weapon he used to slice up his victims. Still, Lamb, Carlene, Varney, the monster, and Sakina all managed to fight their way through these beasts, with Sakina finally being the one to slay Jack by ripping his head off with her bare hands. Another major incident the five were involved in was the alleged Great Moon hoax. Though this is how the authorities and the media referred to it, the truth of the matter was that in the late 19th century, our moon became a temporary base for one of the most evil creatures in the galaxy, the last of the vespertilio homo, named Desquella. The vespertilio were a race of bat-like humanoids who relied on magic rather than science. Desquella was their strongest and most skilled wizard. He wanted to elevate his people to being among the greatest forces in the galaxy, believing their mastery over magic could allow them to build an empire. He was overruled by the other members of the High Council of the Wizards, which led to a civil war on the planet. Eventually, after centuries of infighting which permanently damaged the surface of their world, Desquella sought to rebuild his people, but felt in order to do so, he had to literally start from scratch. He constructed a powerful magical weapon, with the aid of his followers, that not only blitzed the surface of his planet, but also contained its essence within a small magical orb afterwards. This could allow Desquella to not only bring the planet's inhabitants and even its landscape back on another world, but also rewrite them at the same time to be loyal to him, and in other ways that would suit Desquella. Furthermore, the orb could be used to create a seemingly infinite amount of copies of his planet too, allowing Desquella to effectively create millions of copies of his people on uninhabited planets around the universe, and rally them together as an army to conquer the galaxy. His first few attempts to rebuild his world on other uninhabited worlds, however, which he chose to do so rather than his own world, as it was too contaminated, didn't go as planned. He was only able to make the copies of his people last for a few days before fading again. He had greatly underestimated his own power, and even Desquella was horrified at the thought that he may have killed his people for nothing. He became more desperate, and even tried to reshape inhabited planets in the hopes of draining the natives' life force to provide stability. All he accomplished was in either wiping out the native life forms or transforming the natives into hideous abominations. Eventually, the alien wizard set his sights on Earth. Intrigued by its strange magical structure, the wizard didn't simply want to use the Earth like the other planets, however, as he was afraid that the combination of so many different kinds of the magical strains could have unintended side effects. Instead, he tried to turn the moon into a smaller copy of his former planet, using just some of the magics from our Earth that he could safely draw in isolation from our planet onto the moon. Despite being smaller than Mars, magic could be drawn from the moon much more easily than on Mars, because it was closer. Desquella hoped after stabilizing the new version of his planet on the moon with certain isolated strains of Earth magic, he could then use his new army to exterminate humanity. The Earth magics that worked would then become a power base to stabilize billions of uninhabited planets to be turned into clones of his world, whose people would then function as an army to take the universe. By this stage, Desquella actually believed it was better to kill off all of the diverse life forms and replace them with copies of his own people. One race under one king, in his mind, would bring an end to wars and differences. The insane wizard's first attempt, however, still only lasted a few days, but during that time, the famed astronomer Sir John Herschel spotted the new terrain on the bright side of the moon facing Earth through a telescope. This was in fact the only part of the moon to be terraformed, as Desquella did not want to face what was living on the dark side of the moon. Herschel's reports were dismissed in the media as a hoax, but thankfully Lamb suspected that there may be some truth to it, and using his modified craft, he and the others travelled to the moon. Lamb had continued to work on the craft after its trip to another universe, though he was obviously more careful this time. At the very least, it was capable of making small trips beyond the Earth, though still not beyond the solar system. The five arrived on the moon not long after Desquella's second attempt. They were shocked to discover the moon was filled with gigantic bat-humanoid creatures, lakes, forests, and strange animals. In the end, however, they were able to stop and finally put an end to Desquella's insane attempts to conquer the universe, and slay the monster once and for all. Unfortunately, however, in order to stop the new race of vespertilio from conquering the Earth and slaughtering humanity, as Desquella had programmed them to, Lamb undid the spell and killed them all. He had no choice, and they weren't even really alive anyway, being nothing more than mindless automatons for Desquella's cruel will. Still, the experience shook all five of them, and Lamb afterwards kept the orb that could restart Desquella's people for centuries, until he was ready to explore the universe again in the early 21st century, after which he gave it to the Federation of Magic, who finally restored the Vespertilion on another world. The orb was kept in Varney's mansion. Not long after they returned to the moon, however, the orb began to leak on the Earth, causing several vespertilio to escape from it. The reason for this was because it had, unknown to Lamb and the others, become damaged when they destroyed the Squella. Using leftovers of Miss Havisham's magics, which Lamb also stole after her defeat, the family were able to place a magical band-aid, as it were, around the orb, stopping any more from escaping, as well as trapping those who had already escaped back into the orb. One of the vespertilio, however, clung on and stabilized itself using any kind of magic it could from nearby, stopping it from being sucked back into the orb like the others. The magics also had another effect on the creature, however, and allowed it to think for itself, rather than follow Squella's plan. This vespertilio was not evil, but it had a mischievous sense of humour, and enjoyed causing panic throughout the city of London. It earned the nickname Spring-Heeled Jack from the natives, and whilst he caused a lot of trouble for the five heroes, at other points he also became an ally of theirs too, though they didn't quite become a team of 6. The 5 were also involved in stopping the Great Magical Plague of 19th century London. This plague had been brought to the city by the legendary adventurer Sir Jason Prayed. In his lifetime, Prayed helped uncover many lost treasures and old relics. His work proved essential in uncovering vital pieces of our history. Sadly, however, the great adventurer got in over his head when he visited one of the remaining valleys the dragons used to breed dinosaurs in during their war with the gods, as dragons are merely dinosaurs that have been mutated via magic. The valley in question was in the middle of the Mongolian desert, and, like all dragon valleys, shielded by magic. Prayed, however, knew about the supernatural. He had many dealings with it during his adventures, and had even pocketed some other objects from the gods, and with a little time and effort he broke through the valley's defences. The valley was a primeval jungle filled with dinosaurs, pterosaurs, synapses, and human followers of the dragons who were left there to rot after the war. There were also several species of prehistoric demons too, who had made their way here for safety during Genghis Khan's war. Very few of Prayed's initial expedition to this lost valley made it out alive, but the adventurer himself was able to make away with a rare gold statue of a dragon. Ironically, he was disappointed to only be going away with that, as he obviously wanted to bring back one of the dinosaurs. Little did Prayed know, however, the statue contained an ancient weapon that the dragons had wanted to unleash against the gods' followers in order to force them to surrender in exchange for the cure. In the later years of the war, both sides eventually forsook their old rule of not allowing humans to be part of their war. Ultimately, however, the dragons didn't release the weapon, as they felt the loss of life would have simply been too great. Still, they didn't destroy it, just in case, and it was subsequently left in the valley. The statue had a self-defense mechanism, wherein the plague would spread if anyone tried to steal it who wasn't one of the dragon's servants. The 5, who were among the few people immune to the plague, soon approached Jason, who again, using the magics he had stolen from all over the earth, had been able to postpone his sickness for as long as he could, though he knew that it would only give him a few extra days at best, and then, when the virus returned, it would kill him instantly. Carleen, meanwhile, knew the statue belonged to the dragons due to her dealings with them in her own time, and that the virus was most likely to be linked to it. She also knew that given how much the dragons wanted to guide humanity, there is no way they wouldn't have created a cure. Jason, who had also learned about the dragons on his journey, agreed with her, and despite his selfishness and callousness to his previous teammates, deep down he did feel guilt for what had happened, and agreed to personally help Carleen and the others travel to his lost world in Lamb's craft. They had trouble finding the cure, however, not just due to how elusive it was, but opposition from the demons, who, knowing what it was, wanted the plague to spread. The cure was held within a temple in the valley. Only those who completed the dragon's tests within the temple were allowed to access the cure. The dragons didn't just simply leave the cure and the plague side by side, where anyone could get both. In order to get the cure, you needed to be worthy. Lamb, Jason, and Sakina were the ones to undergo the grueling tests, and in the end, Jason sacrificed himself to help the other two get the cure, which Lamb then deposited into the air using his craft to cure London. The Five's adventure in the Dragon Valley also led to them gaining a new ally in the form of a large male Tyrannosaurus rex that Carleen christened Abraham. This tyrannosaur had initially attacked Lamb when he stumbled into its nest. Abraham and his mate continued to chase Lamb, seeing him as a threat. However, when the Freakish family were overrun by the demons pursuing them who wanted to destroy the cure, the tyrannosaurs also became caught up in the fight. The mighty dinosaur killed dozens and dozens of demons, who normally wouldn't dare approach the tyrannosaur territory. But again, they were desperate to let the plague spread. The female tyrannosaur was eventually overwhelmed and slain, whilst the male escaped only thanks to the intervention of Carleen, who had also become separated by the demons from the others. Carleen helped the tyrannosaur back to health, and the creature soon developed something of a bond with the vampire. Tyrannosaurs were not just ferociously powerful, but incredibly intelligent animals too, and the great reptile subsequently accompanied Carleen, who even rode on its back and helped her rescue her friends. The dinosaur proved essential overall in stopping the demons and gaining the cure. Carleen continued to visit the Tyrannosaurus many times in Lamb's saucer, and even enlisted its help in a few instances. Most notably against the giant alien robot, Dathomir, who was actually an old enemy of Lamb and the Federation he used to serve. Dathomir, who was also a Zeta, had abducted life forms from all over the universe in an effort to combine useful traits from different species into his own body to become a super being. He planned to make himself the first of a new race of super predators that could conquer and assimilate the entire Federation. Dathomir had developed this mindset after witnessing many civil wars break out in the Federation. Sadly, despite the propaganda, the Federation was not quite the pillar of virtue that it claimed to be. Many of the smaller species were still exploited to some extent. As we've seen from our own experiences, many of the aliens were unprepared for the new species they encountered, and not all old rivalries between certain species were completely forgotten. Whilst Dathomir may have started out as loyal to the Federation, the death, corruption, and infighting convinced him that it was a universal way of life, and that in order to survive, he needed to be a super being to overcome all other potential rivals. Fortunately, his experiments were discovered by another Zeta, the future leader of the group of monitors that Lamb was a part of, in fact. After several years of living a desperate existence on the run, Dathomir later tracked down the commander of Lamb's monitors on Earth and managed to kill him, though in the process he was also vaporized by Lamb. He was the first life form that Lamb ever killed, and he was so haunted by it he never killed natural creatures again in combat for years. This happened early in Lamb's time on Earth. Sadly, however, Dathomir was not quite dead yet. His spirit was sent into a robot within his ship, a safety measure he had always taken. Unfortunately for Dathomir, however, his ship had been damaged arriving on the Earth, and his robot body was therefore weak and broken down. Over the next several years, Dathomir cannibalized the technology in his ship, along with whatever resources he could on Earth, to construct a new steampunk robot body for himself that stood over 20 feet tall. With this body, he also captured several humans and forced them to build a machine that could allow him to brainwash the Zeta Reticulans on Earth into being his servants, whose technology he could then use to conquer other planets and restart his plan to construct a new, perfect body. After one of his experiments went wrong, however, and produced a psychic backlash that nearly killed the Zeta Reticulans on Earth, Lamb was drawn into Dathomir's plans, though he had to be careful, as the other Zetas were also drawn in too. Lamb underestimated his old enemy, however, and was captured by Dathomir, who planned to use him as a test subject for his plan. But fortunately, Carleen fetched Abraham. The Tyrannosaur easily fought its way through Dathomir's servants, the other mutants he had created, and battled his gigantic robot body in a one-on-one fight, which took them to the streets of Victorian London. Whilst the two giants fought, Lamb and the others destroyed the last of Dathomir's technology and weaponry. The Tyrannosaurus, meanwhile, eventually won out and destroyed Dathomir's body, whilst his mind was captured by Lamb before it could escape again. Lamb subsequently kept the would-be conqueror prisoner for many years afterwards in Varney's mansion. The Zetas who arrived not long after erased the event of the Tyrannosaur robot fight from everyone's minds, though Lamb was also forced to keep a low profile afterwards too, to avoid being seen by the Zetas who investigated the strange occurrences, before eventually returning back to America. Their presence also made it harder for Abraham to be transported home too. The Freakish family were also responsible for rescuing the time-travelling spirit known as Marley, who came from the 23rd century. Marley, in the future, had discovered the leftovers of the gods' time-travel experiments, the very same magics that had given Hearn and others their powers, and gained even greater psychic abilities than possibly any individual who has ever lived. But an unintended side effect of his powers was that after his death, Marley's spirit, rather than simply going to the great beyond, floated through time itself. Eventually, he came to stabilize in the 19th century, where using his psychic powers, Marley guided people and demons to fulfill their true destinies. The ghost soon earned a reputation around London as it helped some of the worst scoundrels change their lives for the better. Though Marley could offer psychic projections of possible futures, he also wasn't above playing tricks on people either. Sadly, however, the ghost's reputation drew in the attention of a particularly vicious vandal named Maxon. Having once been one of the leaders of the Vandal Empire in Europe, Maxon was one of the few to escape the Cushing and the vampire slaughter of the leaders. He had been forced to lay low for centuries, and whilst in the end, unlike almost all the other Vandal leaders, he escaped with his life. It wasn't much of a life, as Maxon was forced to live in the stinking sewers, feeding on the homeless. Maxon first learned about the ghost of Marley when feeding on a beggar who had once been a cruel, wicked mill owner. Marley had attempted to warn him to stop what he was doing, but he arrogantly refused and even tried to exorcise the spirit, which led to Marley instead approaching others within his company that helped bring the tycoon down. The Vandal had his own grudge against the former mill owner, who tried to buy his life by telling him about the ghost. Of course, the Vandal killed him anyway and devoured his spirit, but after learning about the ghost, Maxon decided to hunt it down, not to feed on it, but instead gain access to its knowledge. He hoped he could use the ghost to shape his future to restore the Vandal's power around Europe. Marley, however, was well protected, and the Vandal was forced to turn to psychics to help lure it out. Though Marley was captured and tortured by the Vandal, fortunately he was able to warn Lamb in time, with the alien himself having been guided by the spirit of Marley at one point. Carleen fittingly slew the last of the Vandal leaders herself. Possibly the most important incident the five were involved in, however, was the demon invasion of London in the year 1870. The invasion had been planned for centuries by Satan. He knew that a gigantic portal between his reality and our world would prove too unstable, so instead, he and his demons worked on creating multiple small portals that could allow millions of his demons to enter our world. The first portal was created in London, due to it being the centre of the empire, at that point the largest superpower on Earth. The portal spread like a disease, with there being over 24 within the first week. The more there were, however, the easier it became for them to multiply, until they'd eventually spread out around the world. Each portal formed in an enclosed space, large enough for a demon to fit through, but generally small and insignificant, again to avoid detection. Spaces like cupboards, closets, carriages, underbeds, even pendulum clocks were all ideal places for portals. London was soon infested with hundreds and hundreds of demons, and though the Freakish family were able to discover the original portal and seal it, stopping millions from opening up over the earth, not only did they still have to deal with the powerful demons that had escaped from hell, more portals to hell would still open up in enclosed spaces for the next several hundred years. In fact, the most recent case was only a few weeks before writing this. A child was very nearly dragged into a hell dimension that opened up under his bed before his mother saved him. In spite of the Freakish family's best efforts, there was a permanent damage to the fabric of our reality by Satan's efforts. Whilst he could never send through his army as planned, now and again portals to his hell dimension could still pop up at random. Furthermore, whilst shutting down the centre of Satan's portals, Lamb ended up being sucked into Satan's hell dimension. The others were forced to travel through one of the remaining portals to get him, with Carleen fetching Abraham to help. It was a perilous journey through the worst hell dimension, but in the end, with the aid of their pet Tyrannosaurus, the Freakish family managed to rescue Lamb. Sadly, however, Satan was aware of who had foiled his plan and punished Varney by releasing his vile son Varses from hell through one of the portals, with Satan also transforming Varses into a powerful demon. The reborn former king proved to be the Five's most dangerous and recurring enemy after Hyrak. In fact, whilst Hyrak was always the bigger threat, Varses was a far more personal enemy, having no aims whatsoever other than to destroy his father's life. In spite of these other threats and battles, however, Hyrak did remain the group's most persistent enemy. They'd spend over a decade bringing down his vast empire of vampires, criminals, and demons. Towards the end of their fight with the former vampire emperor, Hyrak exposed Lamb's survival to the other Zeta Reticulans living on the Earth. New monitors had since been chosen who weren't as forgiving to Lamb. Still, in spite of this, Lamb was nevertheless able to help the team finally destroy Hyrak in a final confrontation in an underground village in Edinburgh, with it being Lamb himself that personally killed the vampire. Following the death of their arch-enemy, Lamb was forced to go on the run from the other Zetas. Varney accompanied Lamb, believing that someone had to look out for him and another person look after London. Carleen was ultimately chosen to stay behind. Even though she had known Lamb longer, Varney had some unfinished business on the continent of Europe to deal with, and Lamb agreed to help him finally face it. They both promised they wouldn't be gone long, but sadly, from Carleen's point of view, she would never see either of them again. This marked the end of the family, and in the next chapter we shall explore what became of them after.